The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy with the smells of August, dry dust, cut hay, and the faint, greasy aroma of old iron baking in the sun. It was 1972, a year of promise, and the crowd buzzed with it. Men in seed corn caps stood in tight knots, their faces tanned and creased from years of squinting at the horizon. They talked of corn prices, of the big Russian grain deal, of land values that seemed to have no ceiling. Bud Callahan stood apart from the chatter, a mountain of a man in faded denim overalls, his shadow long and solid on the parched lawn. He wasn't watching the housewares or the furniture being paraded by the auctioneer. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on the death row of machinery lined up behind the barn. Rust was the uniform out here. Faded paint, John Deere green, Alice Chalmers orange, Farmall red, peeked through years of neglect like ghosts of harvests past. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, finally moved to the equipment. "All right, boys, here we go. What am I bid for this fine-looking John Deere Model B? Ran when parked," the widow says. Ran when parked. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Ran when parked was farmer code for God only knows. Bud watched as a young man, eager for a parade tractor, bought the little two-cylinder for $150. He watched a decent-looking Ford 8N go for a price he considered too high. He stayed silent, his hands resting on his hips, a patient statue amidst the nervous energy of bidders. Then Slim moved down the line to a hulking, forgotten beast. "Now here's a real piece of history, fellas. An Oliver Super 99, diesel, 6-cylinder Waukesha under the hood. She's a big one. Been sitting a while, needs some love. Who'll start the bidding at $100? 100, do I hear 100? Silence. The men looked at the Oliver. Its massive rear tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the soft earth. A family of birds had built a nest in the exhaust stack. The green paint was almost entirely gone, replaced by a deep, scaly patina of rust. It was a relic, an anchor, a piece of scrap iron too big to easily haul away. $50, Slim pleaded, his rhythm faltering. "Come on, boys, the scrap price alone is worth more than that. $50 to haul her home." From the back, a clear, arrogant voice cut through the quiet. "You'd have to pay me $50 to haul that junk off, Slim." Heads turned. It was Lyle Peterson. Lyle was everything Bud was not. He was 10 years younger, wiry, with a quick, smug smile. He'd just taken over his father's operation and had immediately gone to the bank, financing a brand-new International Harvester 1066. It was parked out on the road, its red paint gleaming, the air-conditioned cab looking like something out of a science fiction magazine. Lyle walked up and kicked one of the Oliver's flat tires. A cloud of dry, rotted rubber dust puffed out. "Look at this thing. Probably threw a rod 10 years ago. Old man Miller never threw anything away." He looked around, playing to the crowd. "Some guys collect stamps. Some guys," he said, his eyes landing squarely on Bud, "collect junk." The other farmers chuckled, some uncomfortably, some in genuine agreement. They all knew about Bud's place. While other farms were neat and tidy, with new pole barns and manicured lawns, Bud's looked like a machine graveyard. A half-dozen old tractors in various states of disassembly, an ancient gleaner combined with its guts opened up. Planters, plows, discs, all old, all bought for pennies on the dollar at auctions, just like this one. They called it the Junkyard. Bud's expression didn't change. He just looked at the Oliver, his gaze tracing the lines of the engine block, the heavy-duty rear end, the simple, rugged frame. He saw past the rust and the neglect. He saw potential. $25, Bud's voice rumbled, low and steady. It wasn't a bid so much as a statement of fact. Slim's eyes lit up. $25 I got from Big Bud. Who'll give me 30? $30? Lyle Peterson laughed out loud. "Let him have it, Slim. He needs a new centerpiece for his museum." Bud ignored him. He kept his eyes on the auctioneer. $25 once, $25 twice, sold for $25 to Bud Callahan. Slim banged his hand on the fender, and the sound was a dull thud of finality. Bud walked over, handed Slim a worn 20 and a 5 from his wallet, and got a simple bill of sale scrawled on the back of a flyer. As he walked toward the old tractor, Lyle stepped into his path. "Seriously, Bud, what in God's name are you going to do with that thing?" Lyle asked, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. My new 1066 could pull that thing to the scrapyard and not even know it's back there. Bud finally looked at him. He was a good foot taller than Lyle and outweighed him by 100 pounds of solid muscle. He smelled of diesel and hard work, not the new car smell of Lyle's tractor cab. "You see a hunk of junk, Lyle," Bud said, his voice calm. "I see a 6-cylinder Waukesha diesel, a 6-speed transmission, and a rear end that was built to last forever. I see 2 tons of good American steel that's already paid for." Lyle just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "You and your paid-for religion. The bank is a tool, old man. It's how you get ahead. While you're polishing up this relic, I'll be buying the quarter section next to you. You can't get rich saving nickels and dimes." "Maybe I'm not trying to get rich," Bud said, his gaze drifting back to his new purchase. "I'm trying to stay free." Lyle scoffed and walked away, back toward the gleaming red paint and chrome of his new International, the symbol of modern progressive farming. Bud was left alone with the dead Oliver. He ran a calloused hand over the cold, rusty hood. He knew what the others didn't. He knew that under the grime was a machine built in an era when steel was thick and engineers didn't count pennies. He knew that while Lyle was making payments, he'd be making repairs. And when the bills came due, his would be for parts, not for interest. It was a long, slow gamble, a philosophy lived out in grease and sweat instead of ledger books and loan applications. And looking at the jeering faces of his neighbors as they drove away, he knew he was playing the game entirely on his own. Now, before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Think about where things were in the early 1970s. The future looked bright, credit was easy, and new technology promised to make everything better and faster. In that world, who do you think was right? Was it Lyle, using the bank's money to expand and modernize as fast as he could? Or was it Bud, sticking with old iron he could pay for with cash, even if it meant more work and slower progress? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because the answer to that question is the heart of this whole story. Getting the Oliver Super 99 home was the first challenge. It was a deadweight monster. Bud went home and fired up his old standby, a 1951 Farmall M he'd owned for 15 years. The engine turned over with a familiar, comforting rhythm. There was no turbo whine, no hydraulic hiss, just the simple, honest bark of a 4-cylinder gasoline engine. He chained the Farmall to the front of the Oliver and began the slow, arduous process of dragging it the 3 miles to his farm. The journey was a parade of shame for anyone else. Lyle Peterson drove by in his pickup, slowing down just long enough to shake his head in mock pity. Other neighbors stared from their porches. The Oliver's flat tires tore grooves in the soft shoulder of the gravel road. The Farmall strained, its own tires digging in, the Governor opening up with a deep groan as it fought for every inch. For Bud, it wasn't shameful. It was just work. Once it was in his yard, parked next to a Massey Harris 44 and a Case 930, the real labor began. For the next month, in the evenings after his chores were done, and on the one Sunday a month he allowed himself to work, the Oliver became his sole focus. He started by power washing decades of caked-on grease and dirt from the engine block. Underneath the grime, the Waukesha diesel was a beautiful thing, a testament to over-engineering. He pulled the injectors first, carefully labeling each one. They were fouled but salvageable. He spent 2 nights cleaning them, soaking them in diesel, meticulously clearing the tiny orifices with a fine wire. He drained the oil, which came out like black tar. He dropped the pan and was relieved to find no metal shavings, no sign of a catastrophic failure. The bottom end was sound. The problem, he suspected, was fuel and compression. He pulled the head, a task that required a chain hoist suspended from the branch of a massive oak tree that served as the roof of his outdoor workshop. The head gasket was blown between cylinders 3 and 4, a common issue on these old workhorses if they were ever allowed to overheat. That was the culprit. He took the head to an old machinist in the next town, a man named Gus, who still knew how to work with old iron. Gus planed the head for him, ensuring it was perfectly flat, for $20 cash. While Gus had the head, Bud went to work on the cylinders. He honed the walls, clearing the light rust and glaze, restoring the crosshatch pattern needed to seat new rings. Parts were the next hurdle. You couldn't just walk into the dealer and ask for a head gasket set for an Oliver Super 99, but Bud had a network. He had catalogs from salvage yards in 3 states. He made a half-dozen phone calls from the party line phone in his kitchen, the conversations punctuated by the clicks and murmurs of neighbors listening in. He finally found a new old-stock gasket set in a dusty warehouse in Nebraska. It cost him $40, including shipping. While he waited for the parts, he rebuilt the starter and the generator. He recored the radiator himself, a painstaking job of unsoldering the old core and carefully fitting a new one. He took apart the Rusa Master injection pump on his clean workbench, laying out each tiny spring and plunger in perfect order on a clean rag, guided by a tattered service manual he'd bought for $1 at that same auction. Lyle Peterson's new 1066 was a common sight on the road, pulling a brand-new 6-bottom plow, turning over black earth with an effortless roar. One evening, Lyle saw Bud wrestling the massive cylinder head back onto the Oliver's block with his chain hoist. He pulled his pickup into the driveway. "Still playing with your toys, Bud?" he called out, leaning on the door. Bud didn't stop his work, carefully lowering the head, guiding the studs into their holes. "Just keeping busy, Lyle. You know, for what you're spending on parts and all this time, you could have made a down payment on a decent used tractor. A John Deere 4020 maybe. Something that was built in this decade." "This tractor doesn't have a payment," Bud said, not looking up. "The parts will be paid for when they arrive. My time is my own. When I'm done, I'll own it. All of it." "Yeah, you'll own a 20-year-old tractor that'll probably break down in the middle of planting," Lyle countered. "I made one phone call to the bank. My new plow was delivered the next day. That's efficiency. That's how you make money." "There's more than one way to measure wealth, Lyle," Bud grunted, finally setting the head in place. Lyle just laughed and drove off, leaving Bud in a cloud of dust and the quiet solitude of his work. The scorn didn't bother Bud. It was like the weather, a thing to be noted, but not something that could stop the work. What did gnaw at him, just a little, was the kernel of truth in Lyle's words. His way was harder. It was slower. A single, unfixable breakdown could cripple his whole operation. The day the gasket set arrived, Bud worked until well after midnight. He torqued the head bolts down in their proper sequence, adjusted the valves, and reinstalled the injector pump and lines. He filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with new 30-weight oil. He bled the fuel system, cracking each injector line until a clear stream of diesel fuel squirted out, free of air bubbles. Finally, the moment of truth. He hooked up 2 heavy-duty 6-volt batteries in series to get the 12 volts the starter needed. He climbed onto the steel seat, the metal cold against his legs. He took a deep breath, the smell of fresh paint from the valve cover filling his nostrils. He pulled the throttle to half, engaged the decompression lever, and hit the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly at first, a deep, rhythmic whoomp, 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 clearing the air from the cylinders. He let it turn for a good 10 seconds, then dropped the decompression lever. The engine's rotation slowed as it fought against full compression. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then a single cylinder fired with a cough of black smoke, then another, and then, with a thunderous roar that echoed across the quiet fields, the 6-cylinder Waukesha diesel engine exploded to life for the first time in a decade. A plume of black and blue smoke billowed from the open exhaust stack, clearing as the new rings began to seat. The engine settled into a deep, powerful, clattering idle that made the very ground beneath Bud's feet tremble. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated mechanical power. It was the sound of victory. Bud sat there for a long time, a rare small smile on his face, listening to the music of his labor. He had taken $25 worth of scrap and with his own 2 hands turned it back into a 70-horsepower tractor. It was his, and it owed no man a dime. The years that followed settled into a rhythm defined by the seasons and the starkly different philosophies of Bud Callahan and Lyle Peterson. The early 1970s were a golden age for American agriculture. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union had sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence row to fence row. It was a time of boundless optimism, fueled by easy credit and the belief that the boom would never end. For Lyle Peterson, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. The profits from his first few years with the 1066 were astounding. But instead of banking the money or paying down his debt, he used it as leverage. He went back to the bank, his profit and loss statements his proof of concept. The bankers, eager to loan money in a booming farm economy, saw him as a visionary. They gave him a line of credit that would have made his father faint. Lyle bought the 160 acres to the east of Bud's farm. The first thing he did was bring in a bulldozer to knock down the old farmhouse and barn, pushing the history of a family into a pile to be burned. He wanted a clean slate, a blank canvas for his modern operation. Then he went shopping. He traded in the 1066, which was only 3 years old, for one of John Deere's new Sound Guard tractors, a 4430. It was the pinnacle of farm technology. The cab was a quiet, air-conditioned bubble, complete with an AM/FM radio and a cushioned hydraulic seat. Compared to Bud's open-station tractors, it was a spaceship. He didn't stop there. He bought a new, bigger planter, a 12-row John Deere Max Emerge. He bought a new Gleaner L combine, a massive machine with a 20-foot grain head that could harvest more in an afternoon than Bud's old Alice Chalmers could in 2 days. Lyle's farm became a showcase. His equipment was always clean, always new. His fields were perfect, long, uninterrupted rows stretching to the horizon. At the co-op, he was held up as the example of the future. He was farming with a business plan, not with nostalgia. Meanwhile, Bud Callahan continued on his own steady, deliberate path. The boom years were good to him too. His yields were just as strong as Lyle's. He didn't have the newest hybrid seeds or the most precise chemical application, but he knew his soil. He rotated his crops, used manure from his small herd of cattle, and worked the ground with a patient hand. The money came in, solid and real. But Bud's reaction to the windfall was radically different. He didn't see it as an opportunity to take on more debt. He saw it as a chance to solidify his independence. His neighbors watched, baffled, as he continued to frequent the auctions and farm sales. After one particularly good harvest, he paid $700 cash for a Minneapolis Moline G1000 Vista. Another forgotten giant with a cab that looked more like a greenhouse, its engine silent for years. The talk in the diner was merciless. "Did you see what Bud dragged home now?" one would say. "That big yellow thing? Looks like a school bus hit a tractor." "He must have $20,000 in the bank," another would speculate, "and he's spending it on junk. If he'd just go to the bank, he could buy that quarter section south of him and really make some money." Lyle, holding court in his usual booth, would just sip his coffee and smile. "He's scared," Lyle would pronounce with authority. "He doesn't understand leverage. He's thinking like his grandpa. You can't survive farming like that anymore." To them, Bud's growing collection of old iron was proof of his eccentricity, his failure to grasp the new reality. To Bud, it was an arsenal. The Minneapolis Moline had a powerful 504 cubic inch diesel engine. He spent that winter overhauling it, just as he had the Oliver. When he was done, he had another high-horsepower tractor for a fraction of the cost of a new one. More importantly, he had a complete set of spare parts. If the transmission went out on one, he had another. If an engine threw a rod, he had a replacement. His junkyard wasn't a museum, it was an insurance policy written in steel and grease. He lived simply. His house was small and tidy. He didn't take vacations. He didn't buy new trucks. When his old Farmall M finally needed a complete engine rebuild, he did it himself over a winter, meticulously measuring the crankshaft journals, ordering new bearings, and putting it all back together with the care of a watchmaker. He found a deep satisfaction in it, in the self-reliance. Every bolt he tightened was a declaration of independence from the bankers and the salesmen. But as the 70s wore on, the signs of trouble began to appear, small cracks in the foundation of the agricultural boom. Bud heard them on the radio as he worked in his shop. News about an oil embargo, about gas lines in the cities. The price of diesel fuel, his lifeblood, started to creep up. The cost of fertilizer, tied directly to natural gas prices, doubled in a single year. One afternoon at the parts store, the owner, a weary man named Frank, shook his head as he tallied up Bud's order. "Can't believe the prices on this stuff anymore, Bud," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Every week, the suppliers send a new price sheet. Everything's up. Interest rates, too. The bank called me yesterday. My operating loan is going up 2 points." Bud nodded slowly, processing the information. He paid his bill in cash and walked out. On the way home, he drove past Lyle's expanding empire. A new grain bin was going up, the shiny corrugated steel glinting in the sun, the name of a big construction company emblazoned on the side. Lyle was standing there, pointing, directing the crew, looking every bit the triumphant CEO of a growing corporation. He was building his kingdom on the assumption that corn would stay at $3 a bushel and interest rates would stay at 7%. That evening, Bud sat on his porch, watching the heat lightning flicker on the horizon. The air was thick and still, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. He looked at his own farm. The barns were old, their paint faded and peeling, but their roofs were sound because he'd patched them himself. The tractors, parked in a neat row, were a motley collection of colors and brands, but he knew every nut and bolt on them. They were ready for the harvest. His land was paid for. His machines were paid for. He had money in the bank, earning a modest interest. He looked across the fields toward the flashing lights on Lyle's new grain leg, a beacon of progress and debt. A deep sense of unease settled in his gut. He didn't know much about international economics or the Federal Reserve, but he knew farming, and he knew that trees don't grow to the sky. He knew that every boom is followed by a bust. And he had a terrible feeling that the storm clouds gathering on the economic horizon were going to be far more devastating than anyone, especially Lyle Peterson, could ever imagine. The late 1970s arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping dryness. The spring of '78 was stingy with its rain, and the summer that followed was a brazen thief, stealing moisture from the soil with a relentless brassy sun. The corn leaves in Lyle Peterson's immaculate fields began to curl inward during the heat of the day, a thirsty, desperate gesture. His new center pivot irrigation system, another marvel financed by the bank, hissed day and night, drawing down the aquifer, but it could only do so much. The cost of running the big diesel pump for the pivot was staggering, a daily drain on his already strained operating loan. Bud Callahan watched the sky and his own fields with a practiced eye. His corn was suffering too, but his soil, enriched for years with manure and crop rotation, held the water a little longer. He didn't have irrigation. He had patience and a deep understanding of the land's limits. When it was too dry to cultivate, he didn't burn fuel driving back and forth. He went to his shop. He pulled the engine on his old Massey Harris 44 and gave it a fresh set of rings and bearings, work he knew it would need before the next season. He paid for the parts with cash from a coffee can he kept on a shelf. The first real crack in Lyle's gleaming empire appeared during planting season the next year. His John Deere 4430, the pride of his fleet, suddenly went quiet in the middle of the field, its sophisticated hydraulic system dead. Lyle spent an hour checking fuses and connections, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt to restart it. Finally, he had to call the dealer. A young mechanic in a pristine service truck arrived hours later. He plugged a diagnostic tool into a port under the dash, an act that seemed as foreign as sorcery to the older farmers watching from the road. After 20 minutes of tapping on a keypad, he delivered the verdict. "It's the main hydraulic control valve, Mr. Peterson. It's a sealed unit, can't be rebuilt. We'll have to order one." "Order one?" Lyle snapped, his face red with a mix of sun and anger. "I'm in the middle of planting. When will it get here?" 3-4 days if we're lucky," the mechanic said, avoiding eye contact. "Comes out of the regional warehouse in Moline, and, the part's going to be about $900, plus my service call and the labor to install it." Lyle looked like he'd been punched. Over $1,000, and his tractor, his 2-year-old $50,000 tractor, was useless for the better part of a week during the most critical time of the year. 2 days later, Bud's old Minneapolis Moline G1000, pulling his 8-row planter, blew a clutch. It was a major failure, the kind that could cripple an operation. But Bud didn't panic. He unhooked the planter, drove the tractor back to the yard in a low gear, and parked it under the big oak tree. He walked over to a nearly identical G1000 he'd bought for scrap 3 years earlier. Its engine already pulled for another project. Using his chain hoist and a set of heavy-duty wrenches, he spent the afternoon pulling its transmission. It was heavy, greasy, back-breaking work. By sunset the next day, he had the replacement clutch and transmission installed in his primary tractor. He had missed one day of planting. His total cost was a few scraped knuckles and a $5 tube of gasket sealer. The men at the diner who had called his junkyard a waste of money had never factored in the cost of downtime. The whispers about Lyle started that summer. He was short-tempered at the co-op, arguing over the price of herbicide. His account there, once his badge of honor, was now a source of constant tense phone calls from the manager. People saw his wife's car at the grocery store, saw her face etched with worry. The pressure was building, a direct result of the economic forces brewing far beyond their quiet corner of the heartland. Inflation was rampant, a national disease. To fight it, the Federal Reserve began to raise interest rates, a move that was like tightening a noose around the neck of every farmer who had bet the farm on cheap credit. Lyle's loans weren't fixed, they were variable, tied to the prime rate. Every tick upward at the Fed was another shovel of dirt on his financial grave. The breaking point came with the winter wheat harvest. Lyle's big Gleaner L combine, a technological marvel of belts, chains, and sensors, developed an electrical gremlin. A warning buzzer would scream for no reason, shutting down the entire machine. He had the dealer out 3 times. They replaced sensors, they replaced wiring harnesses, but the problem persisted, intermittent and maddening. He lost days of harvesting time while the custom cutters rolled through the county, their machines running day and night. Bud chugged along in his old Alice Chalmers Gleaner A, a machine so simple it had barely a dozen wires on it. It was slow, it was loud, it left a little more grain in the field than Lyle's new machine. But it ran. Every evening Bud would spend an hour with his grease gun and his wrenches, checking belts, listening to the bearings, tending to his machine like a trusted old horse, and every morning it would start. He got his crop out of the field, every last bushel. As he finished his last pass, a cold autumn wind blew across the stubble, carrying with it the scent of rain and the unmistakable feeling of an ending. The golden age was over. The reckoning was at hand. The news came over the crackling AM radio in Bud's shop on a cold day in January 1980. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced an embargo on all grain sales to the USSR. Bud stopped his work, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, and listened as the announcer explained the implications. The bottom was about to fall out of the market. And it did. Overnight, the price of corn dropped by nearly $1 a bushel. For farmers who had stored their grain, hoping for a winter price rally, it was a catastrophe. Their net worth, so impressive on paper just weeks before, evaporated into thin air. The mood at the diner turned from optimistic chatter to hushed, fearful whispers. Men who had been planning to buy new pickups were now wondering how they would make their land payments. For Lyle Peterson, the grain embargo was the final, fatal blow. He had borrowed against the value of the grain in his shiny new bins. When the price collapsed, the bank immediately issued a margin call. He had to cover the difference in value, but he had no cash. His credit was maxed out. His only option was to sell the grain at a massive loss. But even that wouldn't be enough to satisfy the bankers, who were now looking at his entire portfolio of loans with cold, unforgiving eyes. The letters started arriving in certified mail. Loan payment due, interest rate adjusted to 18%, 20%, 21%. The numbers were surreal, impossible. Lyle had built an empire on the assumption of 7% interest and $3 corn. The new math was a death sentence. The community watched the dismantling of his dream in slow motion. First, the dealer came and repossessed the John Deere 4430 and the big planter. They sat on the dealer's lot for months, a testament to the frozen credit market. Then a flatbed truck arrived to haul away the Gleaner combine. Lyle stood on his porch and watched it go, his face a stony mask, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The proud, confident man who had mocked Bud at the auction was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out stranger. The final indignity was the auction notice posted at the courthouse and printed in the weekly paper. The Peterson farm, all 800 acres, the new bins, the big machine shed, Everything was to be sold to the highest bidder. Bud survived the crash, but it wasn't easy. The low prices hurt him too. The difference was the money he lost was his own, not the bank's. He had no payments to make. His property taxes were his biggest bill. He tightened his belt, sold a few calves to generate cash, and kept working. His fleet of old iron became his salvation. When the fuel pump failed on his Oliver Super 99, he didn't call a mechanic. He walked to the back of his grove, unbolted the pump from a donor tractor he'd bought for $50, and had the Oliver running by lunchtime. His self-sufficiency, once seen as a strange hobby, had become his shield. He was an island of solvency in a sea of red ink. He didn't gloat. He felt a profound sadness for his neighbors, for the good men who had simply followed the advice of the experts and were now losing everything. The day of Lyle Peterson's auction was grey and cold, a bitter wind snapping at the canvas flaps of the lunch tent. The crowd was different from the one at the Miller sale nearly a decade earlier. The buoyant optimism was gone, replaced by a grim, funereal silence. These were not buyers looking to expand, they were survivors, picking over the bones of a fallen neighbor, or worse, they were the fallen themselves, there to watch a grim preview of their own fate. Bud stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in the pockets of his worn canvas coat. He watched as Lyle's state-of-the-art equipment, now only a few years old, sold for pennies on the dollar. The big four-wheel drive tractor, bought for over $100,000, went for $30,000. There was no money, no credit. The machines were worthless without the land to run them on. Lyle was there, standing beside his wife near the farmhouse. He looked thin, aged. The arrogant smirk was long gone, replaced by a deep-set weariness. He stared blankly as the auctioneer, a different man with a somber voice, sold off the tools from his shop, the truck he drove to town, the very fabric of the life he had built. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last and most important item, the land. It was sold in parcels. The 160 acres Lyle had bought and cleared went first, bought by an anonymous investment group from Chicago. Then another parcel. Finally, they came to the original 240 acres, the home place, the land Lyle's grandfather had homesteaded. It included the house, the barns, the history. The bidding was slow. A local farmer made a lowball offer. The investment group countered. The price crept up, but it was agonizingly slow. It was clear the land would sell for less than half of what it had been valued at just a few years prior. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice pleading, "Folks, this is the home quarter. Good black dirt, lays flat. Who'll give me one more bid?" The man from the investment group shook his head. The local farmer was at his limit. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once, going twice." From the back of the crowd, Bud's voice, low and steady, cut through the cold air. He named a figure $5,000 higher than the last bid. It was a solid, declarative bid. Heads turned. The investment agent looked at Bud, sized up the quiet determination in his eyes, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was done. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot, "to Bud Callahan." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Big Bud, the man with the junkyard, had bought the Peterson home place. He hadn't bought the fancy tractors or the high-tech gear. He had bought the one thing that truly mattered, the land. After signing the papers in the cold farmhouse, paying with a cashier's check drawn from years of saved profits, Bud walked outside. He found Lyle standing by an old fence post, looking out over the fields that were no longer his. Bud walked up and stood beside him, the two men staring at the horizon in silence for a long moment. "I'm sorry it came to this, Lyle," Bud said, his voice gentle. Lyle gave a short, bitter laugh. "You were right all along, weren't you? All that time I thought you were a fool, stuck in the past. Turns out I was the fool." "There were a lot of fools then," Bud said. "You just did what the bankers and the magazines told you to do. Can't fault a man for that." He paused, then looked at Lyle directly. "I want you and your family to stay in the house, no rent. You stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." Lyle stared at him, his eyes filled with disbelief and a flicker of shame. "Why? After everything I said? After how I treated you?" "Because this is your home," Bud said simply. "And because we're neighbors. That's got to mean something." He extended a calloused hand. And if you're looking for work, I could use a hand come spring. I pay on time." Tears welled in Lyle Peterson's eyes. He looked at Bud's outstretched hand, the hand of the man he had mocked, and after a long, shuddering breath, he took it. It was not the handshake of a victor and a vanquished, but of two farmers who had weathered the same storm, even if one had been in a much sturdier boat. In the years that followed, the landscape of the community changed. For sale signs bloomed like weeds along the county roads. The farm crisis reshaped the heartland, consolidating land into the hands of corporations and the few, like Bud, who had avoided the siren song of debt. The perspective on Bud Callahan shifted completely. The men who had called his farm a junkyard now showed up at his door, hat in hand. "Bud, my old 4010 won't start. You got any ideas? Bud, I need to find a water pump for a case. Can I look through your iron pile?" His junkyard had become a library, a vital archive of mechanical knowledge and obsolete parts. He never turned anyone away. He would walk out to his rows of silent, rusting tractors, find the needed part, and tell them, "Just pay me what you think it's worth when you can." He became the quiet, unofficial patriarch of the county's survivors, the keeper of the old ways that had suddenly become the only ways. Lyle Peterson worked for him for 2 years, a humbling but healing period. Eventually, Lyle took a job in town selling seed, his spirit mended, his arrogance replaced by a hard-won wisdom. He and Bud remained friends for the rest of their lives. By the time the late 1980s arrived, the farm economy had begun to stabilize. Bud's operation had grown to over 1,000 acres, all of it paid for. He was, by any measure, a wealthy man, but his life hadn't changed. He still drove his old pickup truck, still wore his faded overalls, still found his greatest satisfaction not in a bank statement, but in the deep, throaty roar of a Waukesha diesel engine firing to life on a cold morning. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was in the shop with his grandson, a boy of 14 with bright, curious eyes. They were hunched over the engine of the old Farmall M, the first tractor Bud had ever owned, teaching the boy how to set the valve lash with a feeler gauge. "Grandpa," the boy asked, wiping a smudge of grease from his nose, "why do we still use all this old stuff? Dad says Mr. Henderson down the road has a new tractor with a computer in it. It practically drives itself." Bud stopped, turning the wrench over in his gnarled, powerful hands. He looked at the boy, then around the shop, at the shelves of neatly organized parts, at the Oliver Super 99 parked just outside, its faded green paint a badge of honor. "There's nothing wrong with new," Bud said, his voice a low rumble, "but you have to understand what it costs. I don't just mean money." He tapped the boy's chest with a greasy finger. "That new tractor owns Mr. Henderson. If it breaks, he has to call a man with a laptop to fix it. He has to pay whatever that man wants to charge. He makes a payment on it every month, whether the sun shines or the rain falls. That tractor tells him what to do." He gestured toward the old Farmall. "This iron, though, we own it. If it breaks, we fix it. If we need a part, we find it or we make it. It doesn't tell us what to do. It asks. It asks for fuel, for grease, for a little bit of care, and in return, it gives us everything it has. It doesn't own us, son. We own it." He smiled, a rare, wide grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It's not about getting rich, it's about staying free." He put his arm around his grandson's shoulders, and together they looked out the wide door of the machine shed. The low afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, across the land that was his, paid for in cash, sweat, and a wisdom that the world had been in a hurry to forget. In the distance, one of his hired men was plowing with the Minneapolis Moline, its deep rhythmic growl a steady heartbeat across the quiet land. It was the sound of independence. It was the sound of a legacy, built not on credit or speculation, but on $25 worth of junk, and a lifetime of knowing the difference between price and value.